Hi, I'm Bonnie Steinroder, and I'm the pastor.
And I'm John Moore, and I'm the policeman.
We want to welcome you this evening to our new episode of The Pastor and the Policeman. We're discussing a subject that I think is timeless and timely all at the same time. It's Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open is the name of the book, and we're going to be discussing free speech and freedom of the press.
Okay. So just a quick synopsis, Bonnie, in terms of what we found in this book. Actually, I'll ask you up front, did you like it?
Did I like the book itself?
Yes.
I thought the book itself was a little hard to get through, but I appreciated that it laid the groundwork, and one of the things that I really appreciated about it is it helped me understand that the moment the printing press was invented, people were trying to shut it down. So even though I feel, and we'll talk about this a little bit with our guests too as we get into it, we'll talk a little bit about, is it different today? How are things different? Because it feels like it's so difficult right now, and there's so many issues around the press, but it's helpful for me to remember that it's been going on as long as the press has been around.
It has.
What did you think of the book?
You know, I liked it. From my viewpoint, I think it was a little too legalese.
And that from a lawyer.
And that from a lawyer. But you know, there was a lot of good information in there, and I'm just going to run down some of the talking points that I got from it.
Yeah, let's just set the stage.
We'll set the stage, and then you can introduce our guest and
awesome.
Who's from the field.
Great.
And get his opinion on it as well.
Great.
So freedom of the press, First Amendment, right next to freedom of speech. Right. They're intertwined. You know, you got to look at the context of this book. It was written back in 2010.
Right.
So almost 10 years old. It was a different time back then. Things change so quickly now.
Yes.
So you got to keep that in mind in terms of what he wrote. But some of what he wrote still applies today. He talks about the press being the guardian of American democracy.
Yes.
One of the things that he said in here that I really liked was that the press could be considered the fourth branch of government. Yeah. Yeah. The check and the balance on the other three branches, which I thought was very good. He talks about how journalism is a profession as opposed to a job, how journalists need to be on top of all the facts wherever they're reporting from. He talked about the independence of the press, the access of the press to different parts of the world, and to any documents or any people that they have to speak to so that they can actually get the truth to us. He talked about how the press should be allowed in trials, which is part of our Constitution as well, with public trials. Freedom of information. And he talks about the other side, too, in terms of regulations and censorship of the press, which has happened at different levels over the years. So, you know, I think it was good in terms of instructing us on the history of the freedom of press. But I think we also have to look at where is it today.
Right, and things have changed. It seems like they change day to day.
They do.
Let alone 10 years ago. But again, I appreciated the history, and it's always good for me to remember to keep things in historical perspective, which is great. Yep. And I do want to bring in our guests now. We're really fortunate tonight to have Chris Cain. Chris Cain, and along with his wife, are the publishers of the Holliston Reporter here in town. And Chris comes to this kind of new, but a lot of other experience as a biologist and in the corporate world. Chris relocated here, how many years ago, Chris?
A little over 3 now, yeah.
Right, to be near your grandchildren.
Yep.
And found himself asking if there was anything he could do to help with the Holliston Reporter, and now he finds himself as the publisher. Good lesson for us all to never ask those questions, right? Yes. But lucky for us, you and Yvette are now our publishers, and we're so glad that you could be with us tonight.
Well, thank you.
One of the things I thought we could start off by talking, we were talking about it a little bit off camera, is, and it goes along with the historical perspective, I think I can speak for all three of us, saying that when we were growing up, there were basically 3 channels that you could watch. And there was the nightly news. Families gathered around the TV. They watched the same reporter give the same information. And at least in the household I grew up in, we didn't have a talk about whether it was fake news or whether it was liberal or conservative. It was the news. And we entrusted those reporters to give us what we then took as facts. Now, maybe that was right, maybe that was wrong, but at least it seemed like we were all operating from a similar base. And now that's not true, right? We have, if you're liberal, you can tune into one channel. You can turn into another channel. If you're conservative, and you can, especially on the opinion shows, you can hear people echo back what your own opinion is. And so we can be operating from very different facts. And so given that that's so, like, how do we find the facts? How do we find what's true? Is it a good thing that we now have all these channels, or were we better off before?
Well, it's fascinating to me. I was thinking about the printing press and the physical limitations of that, and the resources of paper, et cetera. So there was a finite space that kind of print media, and now you see that space is shrinking.
Yes.
And then it became radio and television, and now we have radio and television frequencies, also a limited commodity, and so only so many things can fit in that bandwidth. But now we're in the internet, which to me appears to be limitless.
Right.
And so the First Amendment in space, I think, is really where the author was heading towards, which is, okay, so how does this get implemented? How do the same freedoms cross the ocean and go to other countries?
Right.
I got a question for you in terms of online, because your newspaper is online.
Right.
I mean, in terms of sources, how do you guys fact check your sources? Is it different than, say, the print media or the television media?
So I think I have to confess pretty much right up front that I wouldn't call myself a journalist yet.
Okay.
Based on what I've been reading and learning in this book, journalists really get an in-depth kind of research, and that kind of goes with my background in science, so I kind of been intrigued by that. Our work seems to be, I would call it more in reporting, and so what is going on, what event just happened, or whatever. And so our sources are public people who have an event. Bonnie will send something over.
I send things all the time.
and that's fine, and so we want to know what's going on. So that's we see our purpose as being a community resource.
Right.
Almost like the public relations firm for the town government in some ways. Yeah. And getting those words out. So I think those are our sources, but we don't go deep necessarily.
Right. I mean, I think you make a great point, and he makes the point in here as well, that distinguishing line between a journalist and a reporter.
Yeah.
And I actually made the mistake one time. I had a journalist come to one of my college classes, and I announced him as a reporter.
Right.
And yeah, right. And I was corrected right away. Yeah. But they do go deeper. They are more probably opinion oriented, as opposed to just reporting the facts as they're reported to the reporter itself.
But do you think we are better off having all these different sources and having the internet, or do you think we were better when we had more limited information?
That's a loaded question.
Wow, wow. Well, as a scientist, I would say more data generally is better, right?
Right.
If you use all the data. Now, to your point,
right.
If we selectively, and we do have a confirmation bias built in that will say, oh, this is a good number, I like that, or that's a fact, or that's a number, I like that number, I'll use that.
Right.
So that's scary.
Such a good point, right? Excuse me, if we're using all the data that's out there, it's good to have the data out there, but when we're selectively just choosing this and not that, then we're not getting the whole story.
But sometimes it's not even you choosing it, and I'm going to speak from ignorance here to a certain degree, but especially with the internet, with your search history, artificial intelligence will actually tell you what you might want to read first. So I get news feeds all the time on my phone. they're probably not the same as what, say, my wife or my kids get. Because of any kind of search history that I have or footprint that I have on the internet. So, you know, it's not as wide open as the book tells us. It's more narrow.
Right, that's true. That's like, Netflix. I always know when one of my kids is using my Netflix because it'll come up and say, because you watched, and it'll list 3 shows that I would never watch in a million years, we also recommend these shows. And I'm like, oh yeah, they have my net. But right, so it is doing that. It's keeping track of our habits. And so I know we're jumping around a little bit, but that's kind of what we do on this show. Because one of the things I was thinking about that's very current is the controversy about Facebook. And Facebook saying that they do not feel like it's their job to check whether or not political ads are true or the facts behind them. And on the face of it, I was like, well, that does seem like a good thing. But then a liberal politician said, well, what if I put up there that all of the most conservative Republicans are supporting the Green New Deal? You're not going to fact check that. How would anybody know? And someone said, well, what if I put out that Mike Pence is coming out as gay? You know, who's going to check that? I saw that on Twitter. Twitter has taken a stand saying they're not going to have political ads, but Facebook not so much. And I don't know, do you think that they should be in the business of kind of censoring? Like, where is that limit of free speech, right? And freedom of the press?
So that's where too much information, maybe?
Right.
So where is everyone in a space in their own life where they can take everything, drink from that big fire hose of information, and really get the whole picture? And then we go to the other end of the spectrum, which is the folks who watch a particular network show or a cable show that feeds them only the little bit of things that they want to hear about. I don't know what our world is comprised of in general. I think we have to have both. Because the folks who can drink from the fire hose maybe can balance the folks who have the narrower data feed.
Right.
And a lot of that probably feeds into the present day political situation that we find ourselves in, where we're so polarized based on the information that we will take in as true, and we won't fact check what's been given to us, or we won't look at the other side. I mean, one of the things that's come out, and I think it's been said by several people, is they refer to the press as the enemy of the people.
I was not neutral in my eye roll right there.
No,
I know, because that.
Did I say some people?
Some people. I mean, to me, and that's where this book. So I have read that Nixon also used that phrase, but the difference is that when Nixon was president, there wasn't a Fox News, there wasn't a Twitter. So now, you know, our current president is able to pound that, and his allies day in and day out, fake news, enemy of the people, and only believe what we tell you. And I find that really frightening. I would find that frightening if any politician did that to the extent, because then it's telling us to not, you know, we should look at the news with a critical eye, right? It's not that we should believe every single thing we're told, but we shouldn't dismiss it outright either, you know?
I'll give you the opposite side of that, and I saw it a while ago, and you had mentioned earlier that you were watching PBS, and I think I saw this on PBS, but I don't know the title of the show, but it was a journalist interviewing President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, which he probably thought at that point his presidency was over. And the journalist, whose name escapes me, said to him at some point, this must really anger you that I'm asking you these tough questions after such a debacle like the Bay of Pigs. And his answer was great. He said, you're doing your job. You're expected to be here, and I'm expected to take the hard questions. That was refreshing to hear, but that was so long ago.
So
long
ago.
He was so much younger. He was a guy in his 40s who thought his presidency was coming to an end, and he was taking the hard questions. And he said, I appreciate you being here because you need to be here.
Well, also think about the role of the press. If we're going to jump around and go to Kennedy, I think about that all the time. He would never have been able to get away with what he got away with today, right? Because the press covered for him. They didn't report his affairs. They didn't report a lot of the things that he was doing, and so he was able to maintain the kind of image that he was more in control of his image. I think people were back then. Now you can see why politicians don't want to talk to the media in a way, right? Because everything is covered, every minute detail. But on the other hand, what distinguishes us, and he kept talking about this too, there are journalists all around the world right now who are still being imprisoned, who are still being murdered. And what distinguishes us is that we have this free press. And our presidents have always supported that until recently. And so I think the minute we let that crumble, then where are we?
Right.
Where are we? So I think it's such an important feature of our, going back to it was put in the Constitution for a reason.
Right. And they're not going to go away either.
Right.
And one of the things I learned from a previous occupation was that if you have a newsworthy event, you get out front of it. You drive the narrative to it. If you don't...
Is that your police occupation?
Yes. If you don't drive the narrative, and I'm not putting aside the fact that you do need to be truthful and you need to fully inform the public, but you need to drive that narrative or someone else will, and it might be someone with less facts than you have. So you were going to say, Chris?
Well, there's two pieces now. The first piece was that when we think back to John Kennedy, we think of then Walter Cronkite, who was contemporary with him, right? And when it came on, we trusted the news. Now we're 50 years later, 60 years later, and we don't trust the news. So what's happened? That bothers me, is that fundamentally the Fourth Estate has lost some of its credibility.
Right.
So just to prove that I read the book, at least, so all these little colorful things here are from my 3-year-old granddaughter, who got a hold of her.
You're going to give her a plug?
Yeah, and so she pointed out some important pieces in here. But one of them was that the future of the free press has to be legitimized through the courts as a right and not by the grace of the government, because it depends on who's in power, it seems, or at least who's in office and who's running the show, how much access the press has. And really the idea that the press can't have unfettered access, but what is the limit? And it seems the line changes depending on what time of season it is, or if it's election time or whatever. And that bothers me, that there's this fluid space that we have to operate in.
Right. And I think I also have great concern now that, reporters say that people come up to them and yell at them and say horrible things to them and threaten them. And again, maybe that was going on, 10, 20 years ago, but I don't think so. Not to this extent. The press isn't to be used by politicians or by anybody to put forth a particular view, right? It's supposed to be free. It's supposed to be independent. And I feel like when I turn the news on, I do have a critical eye. I do look things up. I try to but I don't feel, I don't have a great distrust of it as an institution. I have a lot of respect for it. And maybe that's age. I don't know. I don't know if younger people feel differently.
Well, when you talk about the younger generation, maybe they're not as interested
as we are. I thought you were going to talk on behalf of the younger generation.
I wish I could, but I can't. I only know from the teaching that I've done that there seems to be less interest in the news.
Why do you think that is?
They get bombarded with so much information from the internet, from their phones, from their laptops. And I've asked them in class before too. How do you try to keep up with this? And I haven't even mentioned their social media, which is probably even more important to them.
Right.
But they do, or they claim to. But I think what's the headline news really isn't their number one priority.
Right.
So.
Well, I think that can be true. I hear a lot because I do consume a lot of news. I consume some print media, but I consume it online too. Like I get the Washington Post, but it can't be delivered to me, so I get it online. I can get the Boston Globe delivered if I want it to. But I think that it's really important, an important issue for me is when I hear all the time people saying, well, Americans don't care about X, Y, or Z, all they care about are kitchen table issues. But the kitchen table issues are not unrelated, right, to what's happening in our country. Whether you can feed your family, whether you have a job, whether you can educate your family, these are all being affected by the policies that are being made by the politicians and what's going on in our country. So I don't really understand that argument that, well, people don't care because they only care what's going on in their own lives, as if it's not connected to what's going on in the larger country. I don't know.
Yeah. No, even in Holliston, I mean, I think that's, I learned the phrase hyper-local. So, I mean, if it doesn't happen in Holliston, we don't really care. But having said that, everything that you were just describing, Bonnie, happens in Holliston. I mean, these are real things for real people. And how do they know when it's time for them to be involved? And I think another thing that I read in here was the idea that the press is really the information channel that makes informed consumers of our citizens. And if we don't have a way to give them accurate, unbiased, level playing field kind of information, how do they make decisions?
That's right. That's right. One of the questions I had before that, I think it's right, why should people care about freedom of the press, about the First Amendment, about any of it in the Constitution? Like, why is that important? And I would say it's important because these rights can be easily eroded bit by bit without us. It's like the frog, boiling in the water, and you don't realize until it's too late what a gift we were given in the Constitution, and freedom of the press is a real gift.
Right. Once you start to take away any of the freedoms in the Bill of Rights, how long is it before other ones start to disappear as well? So you should be protective of all of them. I mean, I said it earlier that the First Amendment, freedom of speech, is linked to the freedom of press. So that if you limit the freedom of press, you are, in fact, limiting freedom of speech.
Right. And how do you make a distinction? So most of the cable channels, I'd say like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, during the day they have their news teams on, right, who are reporting news. And then in the evening they have what I would call opinion shows, and they have their big name hosts. It could be Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, it could be Sean Hannity on Fox, or whoever it is. And do we distinguish that somehow? So I guess I should say I do. So when I look during the day and I see news being reported, I take that more as news. When I'm watching an opinion host, I feel like, okay, it might be interesting to watch, but this isn't necessarily news, right? But there are people who tune in and are fans of the host and believe everything they say.
So it's the difference between the front page section of the Boston Globe and the op-ed section, right? So there's no obvious sign that says this is the opinions voiced here are not necessarily those of whoever. But
that's a really great comparison.
But it's not necessarily as clearly labeled.
Right. That when you're because when you're reading the op-ed page, that's exactly what you're reading. These are opinion writers. But on TV, it can be a little harder to distinguish. But again, and I also feel like, we can't depend upon the government or whatever, to protect this right or any other of our rights. We have to demand it. We have to fight for it. We have to protect that, and we have to speak out and say this is a really important thing for our country and for our freedom, and we have to not be lazy, right? We have to do the work ourselves too.
Right, and in terms of the work, I mean, I would say, you use the term drinking from the fire hose. I mean, take in and listen to as much information as you can. You don't necessarily have to agree to it, but you should know where other people are coming from. I mean, when I instruct police officers, especially at a higher level, they are resistant to reading their own critics. And I tell them, you need to read your critics, because eventually...
I've always liked that about you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've always done that. I really like that.
But I mean, you need to know that, you're going to be confronted with these questions at some point.
Right.
And it could be from an opinionated source or person. Know where they're coming from and be able to answer their questions, because you can't just ignore them.
Right.
Right,
and that's true in my profession as well. Right? There's a lot of different kinds of policemen. There's a lot of different kinds of ministers and journalists and people. We do bring our own views, our own life experience into what we do. But the problem is that, unless we can learn, to read our critics, to hear those things, then we just set up these self-protective barriers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that's what's happened in our country. We've all set up these barriers, and we don't want to hear.
It's a lot easier.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to rethink that, something I've done for 5 years, and now I'm getting new data that's suggesting to me that, well, I have to move a little bit, well, that's not going to be very comfortable for me.
Right.
For two reasons, right? Maybe I was wrong or misinformed, and now I have new information. So that's kind of a tough nut to accept. And then secondly, change is never kind of a easy thing to do.
Right. But one of the things I heard, and we're jumping all over the place here, but I heard this on PBS, I think, of all places again, about the Clinton impeachment, and the reporter or the journalist had said something along the lines of, the American people will always forgive a mistake, they will never forgive a lie.
Yeah.
And that's along the lines of what you just said, which is, maybe I made a mistake, maybe I didn't have all the information when I made a decision years ago. Now I do.
Right.
And I've evolved to the point where I can change.
Right, which is so important. And you would think that, news, journalism, would be something that could bring us together. And that's why, to come back around to where I started, there is a part of me that really longs for that time where maybe there was more limited, but then, like what I said before, but then it was easy to protect people. It was easy for information to not get out. And probably the head of the news organizations had a lot more power. One thing that we haven't hit on yet that I did want to ask your opinion about, because I go back and forth on it, I heard an interview, was it a radio or a TV interview with Edward Snowden? And it was a recent interview, in the past couple of months. And I always thought, okay, what he did was really wrong. You can't do that. You can't take information and you can't give it to the press, or you can't. But then I was thinking about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. And for some reason, that seemed like a different thing to me when really it wasn't. And so I go really back and forth on, people who release information that they're not supposed to release, but some of it is of great public interest and is important. And I just wondered what you two think of it, because I really see both sides of it.
Let you go first, Chris.
Darn it.
I'll go if you want me to.
Well, if you have a prepared answer.
I don't have a prepared answer, but I mean, you're talking about possibly giving away state secrets, invasion of privacy. But on the other hand, maybe this person is a whistleblower and it's for the good of the general public. So where do you draw that fine line? Lots of times it comes down to a court case, and we have a judge or judges that will tell us whether or not the press has gone too far or whether or not they're in their realm. So,
Right, and and the whole whistleblower issue is really, front and center right now.
Yeah.
That we do have whistleblowers. We have channels that they can go through. They're supposed to be protected, but I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting balancing act, because Edward Snowden was saying, and I'm not taking a position on him either way, because I really don't know, but if you believe what he was saying I was trying to get people's attention. I was trying to say that something wasn't right, and nobody would listen to me.
Right.
So I don't know.
But I've had now enough time to answer. I like John's answer, so I'll go with that. No, but So I think that, to me, it's the initiating event. Is the initiating event criminal? So did they violate some sort of national security thing? Then that's bad, and that's kind of the fruit of the poison tree, right? That now it's an illegal search, and we shouldn't know that. A whistleblower has sanctions and approvals for that, right? That's a legal way to do this. And so I think information gained through that is legal process is fair game and should be made public.
Yeah. No, I mean, you make a good point about the whistleblower. It's much different than someone that just, went out into the public through whatever medium and just announced it. A whistleblower will actually go to a third party and say, this is what I have. That third party usually is a person that can then go to the party that's possibly offending and say, you need to correct this, if you can. And then most of that doesn't see the light of day. But if the offending party says, I've done nothing wrong, then the whistleblower comes forward and the information becomes public.
Right.
So, and we're seeing that play out now.
We're seeing that play out now, which is right, and can have a chilling effect. And then someone else will say, well, gee, look what's happening to this whistleblower. I'm not going to do that. Because all institutions are made of people. We have to have the checks and the balances because people are imperfect, right? In every profession. But I guess, one of the things I will say as we kind of wind down, I feel like in a weird kind of way or an ironic way, the era we're in now is making me more patriotic. It's not until I feel, because my own personal viewpoint, this is where my own bias comes out. I'm not a journalist. I can say what I think, I feel like we're being confronted in some very real way of losing a lot of what makes us the country that I've grown up in and always lived in. And those rights are being challenged. They're trying to be taken away. And it's the kind of thing where you don't know what you've got until you lose it. And I feel like in the face of feeling like we could lose a lot and become more authoritarian, I feel like I've become more patriotic than I ever was in my whole life. And now things like freedom of the press and the Constitution and all of those things have become more precious to me because I'm afraid we're going to lose them.
Well, you had mentioned too where in other countries journalists are killed and jailed, and the globalization of the press. I mean, you can read or view BBC News here, Al Jazeera. It's an international game. So doesn't the freedom of press extend there? And if journalists in some Arab country are being persecuted, then isn't the whole realm of the press being attacked? And that freedom is threatened.
Absolutely.
And you're right. So I think, but it starts right here at home.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight, Chris.
Wow.
And we really appreciate you being here.
So appreciate you being on the show tonight.
Well, it's been a great learning experience.
We do these shows so that we can start a conversation, here, and we hope it goes into Holliston and beyond, because the Constitution is so important, and having a guest like you brings so much to it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight, either on Facebook, TV. It's not too late. If you have a comment, you can still put it into Facebook, and we'll go back and we'll look at it and try to answer it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.